Welcome to the Wide Lens podcast, where expanding your perspective on recent history is our mission. Listen to untold accounts from overlooked voices and see familiar stories in a whole new light. Ready to dive deeper? Let's begin.
Hey folks, on this episode of the Wide Lens podcast, we're honored to welcome Steve Englehart, whose 6-decade career at Marvel and DC has redefined what superhero storytelling can be, from creating Marvel's Shang-Chi and Star-Lord to delivering mature, nuanced takes on Batman and the Joker across comics, animation, and film. His vision underpins many of today's blockbuster hits. Steve's impact is unparalleled. He rescued Captain America and, by extension, the MCU from fan service, elevated Wanda and Vision into Disney flagship heroes, paved the way for James Gunn's DCCU with Guy Gardner, solidified Netflix's Marvel slate through Luke Cage and Hellcat, and even brought Nightman to network TV. His fingerprints also grace Doctor Strange, Mantis, the Avengers, the Defenders, the West Coast Avengers, the Green Lantern Corps, the JLA, and the Silver Surfer. In this conversation, we'll trace Steve's journey from his earliest breakthroughs to their cinematic incarnations and explore the creative crossroads where superhero epics intersect with espionage and sci-fi. Welcome to the Wide Lens podcast, Steve. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, I got to say that intro was long and I enjoyed every second of it. And you've been in this industry for a long time, Steve. And so it's pretty amazing how it just kept rattling on of all the ways that you've really influenced and developed comic culture in the U.S. and around the world. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Let's go.
Okay. So, Steve, first question is, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to when you were a little boy. First of all, where did you grow up? What part of the U.S. did you grow up in?
Well, my earliest memories are living in Dayton, Ohio. But at the age of 3, we moved to Louisville, Kentucky. And I was there until the age of 13, and then we moved to Indianapolis. My dad was a newspaper reporter. He worked for the Dayton Daily News, then he worked for the Louisville Courier-Journal, and Louisville's right on the river between Kentucky and Indiana, so he became the Indiana bureau chief. So the Midwest, circled in the Midwest.
That's neat. You know, so writing is in your blood. My dad was a reporter as well, but he moved on and he became an editor of a handful of newspapers in the Pacific Northwest. So we've got that in common. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So when it comes to writing and specifically reading, Steve, what were some of your early reading habits? And if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about specific authors or genres that really fueled your ambition to write. So, you know, you're reading their stuff and you're thinking, hey, I love this. I respect this. I think I could do something like that. What got you going?
Well, what I read from the start was mysteries. I like mysteries. So I read the Hardy Boys, right? My dad had Hardy Boy books from when he was a kid, which was interesting to me because they sort of rewrite the Hardy Boy books every 10 years or whatever to bring them up to current standards. So reading a story that was written for people in the 50s, which was me, and then reading the same story written 30 years earlier when people were very excited to be going 40 miles an hour in a race car and stuff like that, you know, it gave me this sense of changing reality over time, you know, that what I was seeing around me was not the only thing that ever existed or whatever, which I had from an early age. But in terms of mysteries, them and then Dick Tracy reprints, loved Dick Tracy, who was still putting out new stuff when I was a kid, but there were a lot of comic book reprints. And in the Dick Tracy reprints, they had originally just taken the newspaper strips that had appeared in every newspaper in the country, rearranged them, put them in comic book form. And then in the 50s, the comic book code came in, and they had to start taking out stuff which had been in every newspaper in the country. But Harvey, which was the publisher of the Dick Tracy comics, all they did was take out the offending material in the black plate. For people who don't know how comics used to be done. It was a 4-color process: black, yellow, red, blue, and percentages of each. And that's what made up the color palette. So by taking it only out of the black plate, there would be guys pointing something blue with a red streak coming out of it, which would then cause people to fall down. But, you didn't see the gun. You didn't see which again was interesting to me, that I didn't, only later did I see the original versions of it, but I could tell at the time that there was something there that was taken out, and that was intriguing. And how did they do that? And so on and so forth. And the other thing was the Mickey Mouse mysteries at the back of Walt Disney's Comics and Stories. In the 50s, I did read superheroes, but the superheroes were Superman, Batman, and, secondary players. Wonder Woman, not so much. Martian Manhunter, not so much. They were around. And you say, it is true, my father was a newspaper reporter, and obviously I've got those genes in there, but it was the art that really attracted me. Again, this weird thing with the guns that disappeared. But I loved Paul Murray's art on Mickey Mouse. I loved Carl Barks in the front of the book. And I was always interested in the Superman and Batman stories were functional. They were sometimes interesting, but there was nothing spectacular about that era in the 50s, So it was more the art that was dragging me in whatever direction I ended up going. The writing came as a left turn later on.
Were you more of a fan of Batman over Superman because he had more of that detective or crime nuance to him?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and again, similar to Dick Tracy, the weird villains. I don't know if, how much people today know about Dick Tracy anymore, but he had very strange villains, and Chester Gould had a really nice art style. Superman was pretty boring, I thought. I mean, functional again, but nothing spectacular. But Batman, one of the Batman artists was Dick Sprang, who had extreme perspective, and everything looked weird and so forth. And I liked that, so.
Well, I think with Dick Tracy, some things that brought him back is, didn't Warren Beatty do a film focusing
Yeah,
on Dick Tracy, maybe late like 90s? Is that right?
something like that. Yeah. Warren Beatty loves, I mean, I only know this. I don't know Warren personally, but I mean, he loves Dick Tracy. And in fact, I've read that he's held on to the rights to it. He wants to do another one, although he's about 90 years old at this point, I suppose. And every time it comes up for renewal, his rights, he renews them because he just loves Dick Tracy so much and he wants to be the guy. If people listening to this are not familiar with Dick Tracy, I would recommend going online and finding some stuff, because it's good stuff.
I think what's incredible, Steve, is the closest thing we have to Dick Tracy that happened. I couldn't believe it. Is the Dick Tracy watch? I have an Apple Watch,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
it happened, right? And so I
Yeah.
remember reading Dick Tracy as a kid, watching the movie, and just thinking, "Oh, this is magnificent! This is unbelievable!" And
Two-way
so,
wrist radio. It was.
exactly. Which, a little plug for Apple: if folks feel like they're on their phones too much, just get an Apple Watch, because you just toss the phone away for an entire weekend and folks can still call you and text you. So it's pretty useful. But I love that about him. So I remember when I got my first one, I was like, it's kind of Dick Tracy-esque.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to get into some of your published work. But before we did that, I'm just kind of curious, Steve. I remember when I was a kid and I drew my own comics. I created my own comics. I created my
Yeah.
own stories. I just kind of would while away the hours. This is before, digital technology. And so I had a creative mind like you. And so I would do that. Before you got anything published, did you create anything as a kid? Did your mom ever find you sitting on the kitchen table making stuff on your own?
Yeah. Well, again, it's weird because I am a writer now. And so you look back and go, oh, well, of course he was doing that. But it really, writing was not what I was thinking about. But I got, with the Hardy Boy books, I made a couple of my own, at least one, maybe just one. But anyway, I made my own Hardy Boy book. And in those days, there was no computers, right? So you had to like fold the paper up to make a book and then type the appropriate pages to get them in the right order, right? And I did all that, and I did do some illustrations in there too. I made my own Hardy Boy book, and a few other things like that. Yeah, so I was exploring that world, that mysterious world, any way I could.
Did you share it with your family and friends? What did they think about it when they saw it for the first time?
Well, I was a little kid. I mean, what I remember is they all said, "Hey, this is great." I, I don't know if it was or not, but no, I was encouraged, I was encouraged to do it. So,
Awesome. So, going back just a little bit, Steve, you talked about how with the Hardy Boys, what was interesting is that every 10 years they would get a refresh. Maybe
mm,
not really a reboot, just a refresh. So they were relevant with the culture or the technology of the day. Did you ever think when you were doing your own writing, looking back at that, thinking, boy, what I'm writing here is going to be quasi irrelevant in 10, 20, 30 years time? Or did you try to basically like future proof it by making it so fantastic? Did you ever think about that?
no, not at all. I wrote for the moment. I mean, comics, they came out every month we're talking now when I got to comics. They came out every month and you got your hit of your character every month. And it was an immediate kind of thing. I did not think really beyond entertaining people in this moment. The fact that that stuff is all still in print and people still know it is amazing to me. Hopefully there's some value in it that causes that to happen. But I mean, none of that was in my brain at the time. I just was doing what I wanted to do and living in that moment.
That's great. So living in the moment. Speaking of that, did you get a chance, Steve, to keep any of the original comics that you collected as a kid? Do you still have any of those on hand?
Some, yeah. I wasn't a collector, so they came and they went. But you know, when I got into comics, fortunately, it was still early enough that things didn't cost all that much, and I was able to go back and get some stuff that I, had read as a kid, and sort of build a little collection of things that had meant something to me previously. Not everything, but
Absolutely. That's great. So we're going to pivot into your published work. And so you are a prolific writer in this genre. Can you walk us through, Steve, just what was your very first published work and how did you really secure that assignment? So I'm not talking about stuff that you're folding up on the kitchen table, your first published work where you're getting a paycheck for it and people are seeing this stuff. How'd that happen?
well, there's a story there. I was I at the end I outgrew comics like kids do. And then in my freshman year, at the end of my freshman year in college, a guy in my dorm ran up and shoved a Ditko Spider-Man into my hand and said, "You've got to read this."
Where was this? Where was this? What school were you at and what year was it?
It was Wesleyan University in Connecticut, and this would have been the spring of '66. So I read the Ditko Spider-Man and I liked it. I thought it was cool. And Middletown, where Wesleyan is, had a newsstand, a news, not a stand, but a store. But they weren't real rigorous about cleaning off their shelves. And so when I thought I might be interested in comics, I went down there and not only was able to buy like a range of titles, but also several months worth of each title because they hadn't. So that introduced me to the continuity and the soap opera aspects and all that stuff of all these different Marvel characters, which I was discovering for the first time. So that got me into comics. So then I went through college reading comics. And when I got out of college, it was Vietnam War time and I got drafted. I didn't get drafted, was going to get drafted, but I enlisted in order to avoid just being shoved into the front lines of the war. I enlisted as a journalism major because you couldn't, or a journalism person. There may have been an ability to be an artist, but I'm not real sure that the Army had a whole lot of artists, but they did have journalism. And so I did that. And Okay, so I ended up stationed at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland as a journalist, and everybody else in the office had been to Vietnam, was back, had nothing good to say about it. And so that was the environment that I was in the Army. And one weekend, for no reason that I can explain now, I decided I was going to hop on a train and I was going to go to New York and I was going to go find Neil Adams, who I thought was like the best comic book artist I'd ever seen. And I did that. I went to DC Comics at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I knew that Neil liked to work late at DC because they had machines that he liked. And I went, and it was, again, this is sort of before fandom was a big deal. So the idea of somebody showing up at DC Comics and wanting to talk to Neil Adams was kind of a confusing concept for DC. But they sent me in and I talked to Neil and I said, well, when I get out of the Army, would you, be interested in an assistant? And he said, why wait? And I said, because I'm in the Army. And he said, well, can you come up every weekend? And I'm like, yeah, I can. And he said, well, then come up every weekend and we'll work on stuff. And so I did that for 6 months. And between that and the fact I left out a section, we don't have to go back on it. But I mean, when I was in basic training in the Army, there was another guy from Indianapolis. I didn't know him from Indianapolis, but we bonded because we were both from Indianapolis. So I was a journalist, blah, 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 and was going to be in theoretically for 3 years. Whereas he was going to be in for 2 years because he was just going to be an infantryman. And after basic training, he went to Vietnam and he was there about 3 days and stepped on a landmine and died. And that's the first time I, as a young 20-something-year-old, actually knew somebody who died. So you combine that with the fact that nobody in my office at Aberdeen Proving Ground cared much about the war. It was an anti-war time just in general, and all in all. So eventually I applied to be a conscientious objector, went through a process, got an honorable discharge. And so 6 months after talking to Neil, I went to New York and did young entering artist kind of things, backgrounds for people, one-page mystery stories. So that's the first published stuff. Actually, that's first published stuff on my own. The thing I did with Neil got published, and he insisted that I have a credit. Nobody ever credits their assistants, right? I mean, a lot of these guys have assistants.
Why did he do that?
Because he was a good guy. Because Neil was a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
And
so Steve, tell us a little bit about Neil. What would we know that Neil was a part of?
Oh, Neil was photorealistic art. He really understood how everything looked. And that, again, that was fantastic to me. He's famous for doing Batman, for Green Lantern, Green Arrow. And also the Ben Casey newspaper strip. If you ever have a chance to get your hands on some look online for Ben Casey newspaper strip. He was just an incredible, because he was still in the era of newspaper strips, right? Before he went into comics books. He was just considered a titan of the industry. And again, the fact that he would take me on and put my name on something, unbelievable.
So the first thing that you had your name on, Steve, what was it? What specifically was it?
It was called The Soft Sweet Lips of Hell, written by Denny O'Neil, and it was in a Vampirella black and white magazine. It wasn't a Vampirella story. She had her own series, but this was one of the stories in the magazine. So by the time I got to New York, because you had to go to New York in those days, there was no FedEx, there was no internet, and so physically you had to be available to hand things to people and pick up things if you wanted to work in comics. By the time I got to New York, I had a published thing which I could show people, and then I was doing low-level, as I say, breaking in art kind of things. This is all getting to the answer to your story, but all of this led to the fact that everybody was in New York, and so I got to know everybody in comics to a greater or lesser extent. And that included the old guys like Wally Wood and Bill Everett, people who were, generation before me, and also a bunch of new guys who were all coming in at the same time, like Jim Starlin and Frank Brunner and Steve Gerber. It was our bubble in New York, right? I mean, New York's got a million bubbles of people who are all in the same profession or whatever. And one of the people I knew was Gary Friedrich, who was a writer for Marvel and also the low-level editorial guy at Marvel. And a stewardess was murdered in the apartment above his, and his wife, who was from New York, said, I don't want to live, I don't want to spend the summer here underneath an apartment where somebody got murdered. So let's go back to Missouri, where you're from. And Gary called me up and he said, would you like to sit in for 6 weeks at Marvel doing low-level editorial stuff? I almost said no, because I was living way outside New York by that time. I had moved up 2 hours out by train to Milford, Connecticut. I'm not a New York kind of guy. And almost said no, but chance to get my foot in the door at Marvel, sure,
Too much of an opportunity, Steve.
Right. But it was 2 hours in and 2 hours out every day, right?
You did not do that commute every day for 6 weeks.
Well, 4 days a week. I told
Holy
him
smokes.
4 days a week. So anyway, there I am doing this job, art corrections, text corrections, writing letters, pages, whatever. And at the end of 6 weeks, Gary did not want to come back from Missouri, and he didn't want to do any work. So he sent back a 6-page monster story. It had already been drawn by Sid Shores, but it hadn't been written yet. And Roy Thomas, who was the editor at the time, sort of looked around the room. He didn't want to do it. It's like, so he says, hey, you want to write this thing? And I said, sure. And I went home that night and I wrote it. And I liked what I wrote. I liked writing it. They liked what I wrote. So then they started giving me more writing stuff. And that's how I ended up as a writer. Marvel would give you if you had a staff job, you were getting paid, I think it was $100 a week. I mean, it was like, we're talking 70s time frame and money frame, but $100 a week, you could live on that theoretically, but you could also have as much freelance work as you wanted or as they wanted to give you. And in the beginning, they were kind of, like, here, do this. Well, okay, then do this. Well, then, okay, do it, but over time, I filled up my dance card with writing. And so the art just kind of fell by the wayside at that point. I did like writing. As I say, never expected to be a writer, but I liked the writing and they liked what I was writing. And so there we were. So that the answer to your question was that Vampirella story, but that's how the whole thing, it's how I went from art to writing.
Steve, do you still have that original piece?
What, the Vampirella story?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't have the artwork. I mean, I've got the comic. I've got the magazine, actually. Vampirella was a magazine. No, I've got, I have at least one of everything that I've ever done, right?
It's great.
Because, it was printed.
Yeah,
and
you have to have it.
And that's the thing. Again, I was seeing how the printing worked, how the whole industry worked from the inside. That also was interesting to me.
Okay, Steve, so you rebooted both Captain America and Batman. Tell me a little bit about the background of how did that happen? Why did they need to be rebooted? How did you get to be a part of that? And what core themes did you aim to reintroduce or really challenge or change when you did that reboot? What did that look like?
Well, Captain America was the first one. As I said, they were kind of working me into the writing at Marvel. In those days, that meant they still published monster stories, they published romance stories, and they published Westerns in addition to the superheroes. So new writers would work on those 3 non-superhero things. Again, can you do this? How do we still like you, et cetera, et cetera. So the first book that I was given was The Beast. But almost immediately after that, I mean, they were liking what I was doing. I was given Captain America and the Defenders. And with Captain America, Roy said, this is a failing book. Nobody can figure out how to make this work. It's either going to go bi-monthly or it's going to get canceled. Unless,
Why is that? Why is that, Steve? Like, why did they have no hope in Captain America?
because, well, this is what I figured out. And this is what, basically gave me a career. They were billing it as the living legend of World War II, Captain America, the living legend of World War II. World War II was 30 years previous to this. We were in an anti-war era with Vietnam. No, people were not interested in the living legend of World War II, and they didn't have any other idea. I mean, Stan wrote it for a long time. Stan Lee wrote it for a long time, and then other people did, try it, and nobody could get a handle on this guy because he was just something that didn't fit the era. And I went home that night when he gave me Captain America and read, because I'd collected them. I reread all the Captain America stories, was looking for stuff. And what occurred to me was, what if he stood for American ideals rather than any particular spot in America? He's not tied to World War II. He's not tied to the Vietnam era. He stands for America, the stuff they taught us in school. And so 6 months later, it was Marvel's #1 book. That was the key to make Captain America stand for something larger than himself rather than be tied to any particular situation.
Now, if we go back in time with Captain America, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but was Captain America acquired by Marvel through
No.
they created him? And what year did they create Captain America? Because he does, like you said, like Captain America and Thor specifically in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, at least, or in Marvel Comics, they don't quite fit with everything else. So why is that?
Well, Captain America was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby in 1940, I think. It's the first issue of Captain America comics is famous because it's Captain America punching Hitler in the face, and this is before we got into the war, right? But as they always say, Simon and Kirby were young Jewish guys from New York, and they were full of beans, and they had an axe to grind, and they went for it. So Captain America was a big hit in the 40s, as long as the war was going on. But when the war ended, it didn't make much sense, and the book died. They had a brief resurrection of a Captain America series in the 50s, very brief. And then in the 60s, in Avengers #4, I think, they found Captain America frozen in ice. He'd fallen into the Atlantic in 1945 and had not aged and had survived. And, it's comic books. But so they brought him in, and there was a lot of big deal because Jack Kirby was now drawing the Avengers with Stan Lee, not Joe Simon at that point. But it's yeah, we're bringing back this famous guy from the 40s, but that was their mindset, that he's a famous guy from the 40s. And that didn't, everybody else was famous in the 60s, was happening right then and there. So, he was a name, possibly even a legend, but the actual reality of him was not, nobody could figure out what to do with him in the 60s. And so I just transcended the 60s and the 40s and the rest of it. And as I say, that books were on newsstands in those days, and you could turn things around almost overnight, which was what we did. And so, as I say, 6 months later, it was Marvel's #1 book, and that pretty much guaranteed that I had a career doing this sort of thing.
Were you shocked when it vaulted from obscurity almost to #1? Was
Well, I mean,
Marvel surprised? Was everyone like, what's going on here?
I think Marvel was surprised. I didn't know enough to be surprised. I mean, it's you want to do this, see what you can do with it. And I did what I did with it, and people liked it. I mean, I fairly quickly figured out that people liked what I was writing, but I didn't have enough context to know that going from near cancellation to #1 I mean, you can understand that concept, but I didn't, I wasn't astounded or anything because I didn't really know what the norm was, right?
I mean,
Uh,
to some degree, did you think, Steve, like, I got nothing to lose it because they're about to cancel this guy. And so I can just really take this in a different direction because what's really cool about it, and we all know this, is that the Captain America that you created way back then, or you rebooted way back then, he's still the same Captain America today.
yeah, he is. Yeah, it became the default Captain America thing, and Chris Evans did a great job playing that character in the movies, right? But again, in those days, I wasn't thinking, nobody, I doubt if even Stan at that point was thinking about movies. Later he did, and he went to Hollywood and began the process which has led to today. But comics were self-contained, right? There had been a couple of really lame Captain America TV movies of the week. There was a Doctor Strange movie, which was a little bit better than that. But there was also like a Fantastic Four cartoon show, which was really low budget, etc. I mean, like the idea that you could really transcend comics, nobody thought that. Maybe
Do
Stan did, but I mean, nobody else thought that. And so we just did comics and for the people who liked comics.
Steve, did you see the last Fantastic Four film that just came out a
I
month
haven't
ago?
yet. No, I saw Superman earlier, but I haven't seen the FX.
Well, you got to go see the new Fantastic Four, of
Everybody
course.
likes it. Yeah.
It's really good, but also there is a reference to that very cartoon you're talking about quite a bit throughout the entire film.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. They actually take the storyline back to the 60s, 70s for that
Yeah.
film.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Captain America, but also you rebooted Batman. And for
Right.
folks that don't know this, these are two different worlds, people. This is Detective Comics or DC, and this is Marvel. These are two very different comic book companies. So the
Yeah.
first question I'd love for you to answer for folks is, how are you pivoting between these two very different companies that are really challenging each other? How are you working for both of them? And then also a little bit about Batman and what that reboot looked like too.
Well, there were only two comic book companies, basically, and they were both in New York. And since we all knew each other, I would, even when I was writing for Marvel exclusively, I could drop over to DC and say hello to people and hang out. I mean, there were no territoriality issues with any of that. And what happened was I did write for Marvel for 3, 4 years, whatever it was. And then, sort of inevitably, as these things happen, I had a falling out with an editor at Marvel and decided to get out of comics for a while. And my wife had traveled in Europe for a year by herself before I knew her. And I thought, well, I want some of that. So we started making plans to go to Europe. And then I got a call from Jeanette Kahn, who had just been made the publisher at DC. And she said, she took me to lunch and she said, I'd, really like you to come over here and do for the Justice League what you did for the Avengers, which is give them characterizations and more complex stories and so forth. Because they were still, I mean, things had gotten better at DC, but there was still an institutional bias toward blandness, sort of, not, and that's not true for every book that they put out. But I mean, Marvel had passed them by, put it that way.
Well, I mean, honestly, Steve, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. It's kind of like Marvel is the underdog and they're telling almost like postmodern stories,
Hmm.
and DC isn't. They're traditional. And so they're really bound. DC's really bound by some precepts where Marvel could just do whatever they wanted.
I
And for
think
that
that's
reason,
right.
it was probably a bit stifling for writers and artists.
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, I've always thought that Marvel was a bunch of guys who really liked doing comics, and DC was a corporation that hired people to produce content for them. And the people may have liked what they were doing and so forth, but the attitude from DC was just so corporate that it did stifle and it had, well, I mean, they hired Jack Kirby away from Marvel to come over and do stuff. And in his very first book, they redrew him because they didn't think he drew Superman's face right. It's like Jack Kirby was and is, I mean, he was a major talent. Getting him to come to DC was a major thing. And the first thing they did was redraw his faces. It's like, because it didn't look the way they thought it ought to look. That was them. Anyway, so Jeanette was there. She was supposed to like turn things around. And she wanted me to do the Justice League. And I said, yeah, but I can only do it for a certain amount of time because I'm already planning to go to Europe, but I'll do it, within the time frame. But I said, I want to do Batman because I love Batman. And this is my one chance to do Batman. And so I knew going in that I had a certain amount of time to do all the Batman I was ever going to do, as far as I knew. So with Batman, with Captain America, I wanted to get rid of the 40s. With Batman, I wanted to bring in some of that 40s pulp stuff. The early Batman stories are very, dark and pulpy and he's fighting vampires and monsters and stuff and looking cool, very, so that had been lost. But, the blandness of DC had wiped out that early pulp vibe. And the other thing I wanted to do was, I'd always thought even when I was a kid, when I would read those 50s DC stories, Lois Lane would snuggle up to Superman and he'd get embarrassed and kind of back off. And even as a kid, I thought that's not how people act. I mean, a kid might act that way, but not a grown man. So I really wanted to make Bruce Wayne a grown man. And my answer to that was to come up with a grown woman for him, Silver St. Cloud, strong woman who has to be able to hang with Bruce Wayne, high-powered guy. And so the pulp atmosphere and this attempt to make Bruce Wayne an actual adult human being inside that costume, those were the two things I wanted to do. And then, and I wanted to do the famous Joker and the Penguin and hit the high points of who Batman had done. So that, again, very much like Captain America, it was called the definitive Batman when it came out. And I was lucky enough to have two really good artists who could carry that vision forward, Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin. So between the companies, they were different, but comics is sort of comics. If I'm allowed to do, if I'm allowed to do what I want to do, which is what Jeanette told me I should do, then it's mostly similar. And again, I like characters. I'm character driven. And to me, I can see Captain America as a New Deal Democrat who stands for America's ideals, and I can see Batman as a driven guy who lives by night and runs around on rooftops. I mean, any character that I write, I really try to get to the essence of them, and so there wasn't. Yeah, I mean, the only problem that I could foresee was DC's institutional outlook on this whole thing. And I, that was the other thing that I told Jeanette. I said, you got to just let me do what I do if that's what you want from me.
So, Steve, how did they give you so much free rein when to Jack, they basically redrew his faces? How did you get that?
Because I asked for it. I mean, I don't know what Kirby asked for, and I don't know what he said after they redrew his faces. But, because Batman was edited by Julie Schwartz, and Julie was a great guy, really nice guy. But his reputation was that he drove his books, that, there were plenty of true stories that at DC in general, they would like come up with a really cool cover idea, something that would, like might sell this book before they had a story for it. And then the editor would call in the writer and say, all right, come up with a story that fits this picture here. So I said to Jeanette, Julie, I didn't know Julie particularly, but I knew of Julie. And I said, he's got to let me do what I want to do. And apparently she went and talked to him and told him to do that. He never gave me a hard time. I mean, in terms of trying to micromanage me, or resenting the fact that I had asked for and gotten this. I mean, Julie was interested in good comics, and for all I know, he was chafing at the bit that DC had given him too. I don't know, but he was nothing but helpful on this stuff. So I asked for freedom, and she gave it to me. That's all I know.
So you're saying, Steve, that like that example that you shared, it was really at times art driven, and you said this needs to be story driven. We're going to tell great story, and we're going to have art that complements the stories that I want to tell. Is that what happened?
Well, I didn't have any control over the art. I was lucky in that regard. Most of the big guys, big stars at DC had gone over to Marvel by that time. And so the odds were that I was going to get a couple of journeymen to do the art on these books. I just wrote the hell out of them because I wanted to make them as bulletproof as possible. But at the end of the day, if they'd been badly drawn, people can't distinguish. I've said before, if they had been badly drawn, the scripts would have been exactly the same, but the overall impact would not have been the same. But as it happened, there were these two young guys, Marshall and Terry, who were just breaking in at that point. They loved the Batman too. They got the assignment. And so everything about that book, was running at a high level, but I had nothing to do with it. I mean, in those days, you didn't. I mean, the idea now, a lot of people a writer and an artist will get together and they'll go in and they'll say, hey, we want to do something together, blah, blah, blah. But the way comics worked when I was there in the 70s was everything was assigned. I mean, okay, you get to do the Batman. We'll find somebody to draw it. We'll find somebody to letter it. We'll find somebody to color it. I mean, it's like, we'll publish it. You did your part, and then everybody else did their part. So you didn't ask for anybody. And even if you could have, I had nobody to ask for because all the people that I knew who could really do a good job on this had gone over to Marvel by that point.
It's interesting when the MCU really broke out with Incredible Hulk and Iron Man back in, I think, the mid 2000s. Those were really story driven pieces, and the MCU, in my opinion, was so popular because they were all story driven. It was really clean. It was really simple. And then a lot of folks, and I would agree with them, believe that the MCU started to lose its way when things got really complex. They got kind of confusing, where maybe the CGI was driving rather than the story was driving. And it just was less fun. And so, I look at film and I look at different media, and the story, if the story's clear, clean, interesting, compelling, engaging, it really, really makes a difference for if folks are going to want to be interested or not.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with that pretty much. I think, to me, where they started to lose it was when Disney Plus came along, because all of a sudden they had to come up with a lot of content. And quite evidently, they just said, hey, you want to do the She-Hulk? Go do the She-Hulk. And so the whole idea of the universe started to fall apart at that point. And these things all had different tones, and they all went in different directions. And I mean, still the one that's everybody's favorite from Disney Plus is WandaVision, right?
It's the best.
It was the first one, and it was, it was weird, but it was clear. But yes, that, and then, as you say, they started to get to the idea that they needed to put out one every 3 months, and that led to the CGI not, getting done in time, and so on and so forth. I think it was, Superman is a fine linchpin for the new DCU, and Fantastic Four. Everybody likes both of those movies as far, everybody, but they both are successful. They both have done well. And I was particularly, because up until then, people were talking about superhero fatigue and, with blah, 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 blah. But both of those, I think, are good movies. And I think Marvel, took a big step back when things started to, really, when Marvels didn't work, and I forget what else didn't work. The last two previous Thunderbolts was good, I mean, they
Thunderbolts commercially didn't do very well, but I saw it. I loved it. It was
yeah,
great.
it's a good movie. It didn't do because it's nobody knew who any of these people were, right? But I mean, it was not a bad movie. Let's put it that way,
It was
right?
good. It was good.
There'd been some bad Marvel movies that didn't do anything. So I'm pleased as somebody who's involved in this still because now of the movies that they kind of righted the ship at both companies and hopefully they will take their time and do good stuff, as they continue to go forward here.
So, Steve, Captain America goes from irrelevant, nearly canceled to the #1 book from Marvel. What did your work with Batman do to that franchise at DC?
Well, DC is more secretive or about, sales and so on and so forth. But I mean, it was labeled the definitive Batman. It sold really well. It remains in print like a lot of my stuff. When they did the Batman animated show, they took one of my stories and did it pretty much verbatim. So it's sort of the gold standard. But it's interesting because I succeeded in what I wanted to do by bringing back the pulp atmosphere and making Bruce Wayne an adult person. Since then, the Joker has become even more homicidal. I mean, they've pumped it, but that's the direction that they all go in. It's all dark, it's all scary, it's all.
Do you
So
feel do you feel like the Tim Burton Batman? I think that the first one, Batman, came out in '89, I believe, and
89, yeah,
and then the second one, Batman Returns, maybe '91 or '92, something like that.
something like that.
Do you feel like your incarnation of Batman influenced what Tim Burton did for those films with Michael Keaton?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the first one is the adaptation of my story, but in typical DC fashion, every script up until shooting had Bruce Wayne as an adult with a girlfriend named Silver St. Cloud. When the movie came out, they changed her name to Vicky Vale, and I queried them on that, and they said, "Well, that's so we don't have to pay you any royalties." I mean, that's DC again in their corporate nutshell. But yeah, I mean, that was, to my mind at least, that's the first adult superhero thing. I mean, Christopher Reeve had done the Superman stuff before, but it was still kind of light and I mean, Batman definitely is darker than Superman, but I mean, it's like they adapted my thing, and I worked on that movie as well. I didn't work on the following ones, but yeah, I mean, and so I feel, not only did I turn Batman around, but I kind of turned superhero movies around in the same process.
It's interesting that that series of Batman films got progressively after that original director left, Tim Burton, it became more and more cartoony,
Right,
and then it basically just died, and then The Dark Knight was rebooted, and it kind
right,
of came back to that original vision that you had.
right. Yeah. Well, see, comic book movies previous to the 1989 Batman, when people would do comic book movies, Hollywood would do comic book movies, they always wanted to kind of like say, see, this is it's comics, I mean, it's not a real thing. And so there was always comedy in them, right? I mean, the Lex Luthor had his assistant, Mr. Luthor, I mean, it was always kind of like, we're not taking this really seriously, it's like we're professionals and we're not blah, blah, blah. Batman was the first one where they took it seriously. But when Tim Burton left, then the people who came on went back to like, yeah, this is silly. And, comics are, we don't really believe in this kind of stuff, which is no way to sell it to comic book fans, but they didn't understand. I mean, and there may even be, it may be explicable, but I mean, people didn't understand comic book fans. They just, studios are used to dealing with movies and they know how that works and so on and so forth. And so adapting comic books is not something that they had a natural aptitude for, put it that way.
Gotcha. So we're going to go a little bit closer to modern day. And for folks that don't know this, I shared it at the very beginning. Steve is also the father of Star-Lord. And he really started out as a pretty obscure character. I'd love to hear from you, Steve. What was your original vision for Star-Lord? And also, how did you feel about seeing Guardians of the Galaxy succeed the way it did? And thoughts on how Chris Pratt maybe played that role. Chris Pratt is from Lake Stevens up here in Washington. Big Seahawk fan, so he's very much a kindred spirit of mine. But what did you think about how he's really evolved to what we see today?
Well, my original vision was very different. I was going to do something, completely different. I wrote the first issue of his, and I wanted to do a guy who was just antisocial and not, and my plan was at the end of the first issue, he had arrived on the sun. Now, physics be damned, he was on the sun, but he was going to travel out through the universe. And my idea was that at each planet, he would have an adventure involving the mythology of the planet. So if he went to Venus, it would be a love story. If he went to
Right.
Mars, it would be a war story, right? I even was hoping that I'd get a different artist every time, that it would, each one would be kind of this little capsule. But the point was that he was going to work his way out. And by the time he got out to Pluto, which was a planet at that time, he would have evolved into this sort of cosmic being. But I only wrote the first one. And then I left Marvel in that same editorial thing that I was talking about. So the guys who wrote him after that, basically, they kind of like figured out how to take the edges off of him, but he didn't evolve into a cosmic being, but he became a more likable version of the character that I had done. If I had to make a list of all the characters I created in their likelihood of being a movie people, Star-Lord would have been at the bottom of the list. I mean, it never occurred to me, for years and decades that that would happen. So when
Yeah.
I got the news that they were going to do this movie with Star-Lord in it, I was like, that astounded me. That was like, what? Really? That guy? But I liked the first movie, right? I mean, everybody liked the first movie. And then in the second movie, Mantis came in, who I also created. And James Gunn, did a great job on those Guardians of the Galaxy movies, which is why DC hired him to come over there and why Superman is good and all that kind of stuff. I mean, he's good at this stuff. So, and so I was interested to see what Chris Pratt did with him because he found that mid point, I mean, that's something
Yeah, he's
Pratt
he,
can
he's
do.
kind he's
So,
he's kind of funny. He's kind of irreverent a little bit. He doesn't
yeah,
take things too seriously.
yeah,
And he's likable too.
yeah, that's the thing. Well, you got to I mean, I wrote a guy you couldn't like. So, you had to make him likable one way or another, which they did in the comics and then they did in the movies. But, James Gunn clearly likes groups of misfits. I don't know if anybody saw his Suicide Squad, which was also a very good movie. From what I understand, nobody did see it. But, he likes to take. So this is a quick digression, but I mean, I was wondering how he was going to do the iconic Superman when he likes groups of weirdos. So he made a movie with Superman and groups of weirdos, It's like,
That's
um,
right.
so
He's also really good at taking, like, I don't know about you, but I think some of like the soundtrack from Guardians
mm,
is one of the best ever. Volume 1, 2, and 3. It's just great
right,
classic rock and whatnot,
right.
and really, really adds to it.
He's, he's good at what he does.
How do you feel, Steve, when you create and you have this vision laid out for someone like Star-Lord, and then you do a career pivot or career change like you're talking about, and then people take it a completely different direction? Are you able just to let go of those characters, or does that kind of frustrate you a bit?
It doesn't frustrate me, but I do let go. I mean, totally aware that Captain America is going to come out every month. And if I stop doing it, somebody else is going to start doing it, and it's still going to come out next month, you know? But I do find, and this is common, because I've talked to other comic book writers, you tend not to follow the book after you've done it, because after you have really lived inside anybody's head, then somebody else will have either, no matter how close their vision is to what you did, it's not the same. And some people have visions that are very different. And it's, you're trying to read their book, but you're continually going, but that doesn't seem right to me, you know? And so you just don't read the books, you know? But it doesn't frustrate me, because that was the job. You understood that going in, you know? I mean, I took over Captain America from the guy before me, right? And then, you know, it's just, and to expand that a little bit, I mean, in seeing the movie versions of these characters, right? I mean, in some cases, they're very similar, like Captain America. In some places, they're very different, like Mantis was very different. But I also totally get it that those guys are making movies, and they're dealing with whatever they have to deal with. And that doesn't bother me, really. I mean, sometimes it doesn't bother me. How am I saying this right? It doesn't upset me or anything, but I mean, I can certainly, I mean, when I see, well, for example, Guy Gardner, who I created in the Superman movie, I thought he was a little bland, but then I read that he's going to be in this Lanterns TV show, and it's going to be much darker, and he's going to be so he had to play it kind of PG for the Superman movie, but he's going to play it R for Lanterns. You know, and I understand all that. I mean, it's like, they got to do what you got to do. You got to get the rating. You got to, you know, appeal to everybody. So, I mean, I can sit there and go, you know, that's not exactly what I would have done. But and certainly in movies, I don't get upset about it, or, you know.
Well, how about along those lines, Steve? Like, you rebooted Batman, you rebooted Captain America, and for the vast majority of the readership, they were stoked with what you did. But I am certain probably 10 to 20% loved old Captain America that was representing World War II, or loved that kiddish Batman. Did you ever get blowback from fans that said, "You've ruined Captain America, you've ruined Batman"? I liked how he was. Like, there's some folks that really hate change, and probably really resonated with those earlier characters, albeit it was probably a pretty small percentage of fandom.
I think it was. You know, I don't recall blowback on any of that stuff. And again, I mean, I'm sure you're right. There are some people who would feel like that, but I don't think there were very many people. I mean, Captain America was not selling, you know, if it was only selling to the people who liked that old Captain America, there weren't enough of them to sustain the book. And again, all I knew was that we sold a whole lot more after I made the changes. And so, uh, you know, I have had, you know, letters and stuff over the years saying, "Oh, I didn't like this," or "I didn't like that," but it's really fairly rare. And I don't say that, you know, because I'm so fabulous. It's just, you know, hopefully what I did pleased most everybody.
Yeah, I mean, like you
And
said,
you know,
you're true to yourself and what you wanted to do, and that voice you wanted to bring. It resonated with people.
yeah, well, I mean, I was a fan before I was a writer, right? Before I was even an artist. And so I would read stuff, and I read everything. I mean, I read the romances, I read the westerns, I read the science fiction, I read Charlton and Gold Key, and, you know, anybody who was out there. I just loved comics. And so I developed this sort of sense of what I think makes good comics, and what works, and what, you know, people resonate to. So when I did start writing, that's the capital that I was drawing on, you know, and, you know, I mean, what can I say? I mean, it's just like, it seemed to work. So
You know, along those lines, Steve, if you could bring any of your original characters, DC or Marvel, either is fine, to the big screen, are there any that you created or you rebooted or you influenced that you'd love to see out there in a movie as you created them?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question because most of them have been, although they keep finding new ones. I created Dr. Phosphorus, who's in Creature Commandos, and it's like, okay, that, I Dr. Phosphorus wouldn't have been at the bottom of my list, but I mean, he's a pretty obscure character as things go, but James Gunn liked him, so he put him in the Creature Commandos. I would just say that I really loved doing Green Lantern with the whole mythos of the Green Lantern Corps and all the different Green Lanterns and so forth. And when that first movie with Ryan Reynolds came out and was so bad, many people were upset, but I was mad because that is a case where I said, I know what you could do with these characters, and they didn't do it. And it's like, why not? Why didn't you do that?
How did they fail in your mind on that one?
It was, the first 20 minutes of that movie is Hal Jordan flying a jet and talking to his girlfriend. It's like, okay, that's 3 minutes of setting up a relationship, not 20 minutes to start the movie. I mean, they just never really got a handle on stuff. And then at the end, when they did go to all the Green Lanterns, they didn't spend much time with them. It didn't capture anything of the thing. And I think I'm pretty good at, I think I'm pretty good at kind of getting atmosphere as well, like what is the atmosphere of the Green Lantern Corps, which extends through the universe and has old men on the planet Oa, who oversee them, and renegade women from Zamaron who, it's like that's the whole, very Julie Schwartz, if I may say. Julie Schwartz was a science fiction agent before he became a comic book editor, and he loved the science fiction thing. And it's The Lensman. There was a series called The Lensman. That's where Green Lantern came from. But there's so much stuff to do. And if you, the movie person, take a legitimate stab at it and do it to whatever level you can do it, I'm good with that. But if you don't even take the stab at it, if you don't get it right at all, then that just pissed me off. I thought, oh, and I do say, oh, well, I could have done better, which probably is true, but I mean, it's not, I'm not going to get the opportunity to do that, but I can, that movie. So the answer to your question is, I'd love to see the Green Lanterns done well. I didn't create them. I just, I just wrote them, but I liked them a lot.
And I mean, to that point, Steve, the storytelling was poor because that same actor went on, of course, as we all know, to play Deadpool.
Right.
And many believe that he nailed that character. And that has been both a commercial and a critical response to that, hasn't it?
Sure. Yeah. And he makes fun of the Green Lantern movie all the time. Yeah, no, he's good at that. And he would have been good if they'd given him a script, in Green Lantern, and we would have been on to Green Lantern 7 by now or something. But the way that thing crashed and burned was just, that just stuck with me. It's like, oh, that could have been better. The other one, I guess, the character that I did create was Coyote for Independence, for first for Eclipse and then for Epic. I really liked him as a character, and it'd be fun to see him, done well on screen.
So talking about other characters, in the comics, it seems that you really have a special attachment to the Mantis character. And
Right.
for folks that don't know who Mantis is, she's actually in the Guardian of the Galaxy films.
A very different character in the
Very different, very different. So tell us a little bit about your attachment to that character that you created, and why are you attached to that character, and how has she evolved from what you created to what we see on the screen?
Well, I'd always consider the Beast to be, I call him my firstborn, because he was the first character that I wrote. But she's the first one who really sort of taught me some of the secrets of writing, in that I introduced her into the Avengers, and she was going to be this kind of call girl from Saigon who was brought in because she was the girlfriend of an old Avenger who was coming back. And the idea was she was going to like put the moves on every male Avenger and cause dissension in the ranks. That was my idea when I came up with her. But right after that, right after I introduced her, Marvel said that they weren't going to do any annuals that summer. That had been a staple for a while of extra-sized issues with reprints and a big new story and all that. And for whatever reason, they weren't going to do any. And I, as a fan, I had gotten used to having something like that every summer. So I said, well, I'm writing the Avengers and the Defenders. What if I do a crossover thing where they, all summer long, they fight each other for this, whatever. And so fine, I did that. But, and, it's a thing in and of itself, the Avengers Defenders War, that's a thing. But in the process, there was no room for Mantis to go around seducing people. Mantis had to be a teammate because it was a series. The books were a series of individual battles between an Avenger or two Avengers and an Defender or two Defenders, however the thing worked. But she had to be a teammate. And so she was. She did a good job being an Avenger. And all of a sudden, I couldn't turn her into a seductress, a femme fatale anymore, because she determined herself as something else. And that's where I learned that the characters will tell you who they are.
That's
that you
good.
can say, oh, I'm going to do this.
Right.
As a writer, I'm going to do this. But when you start actually telling the stories, the characters are reacting to whatever's going on in the stories. And as they react, and as you go, well, this would be her reaction here, this would be her reaction here, then pretty soon she's not the person that you thought she was going to be. And so then I sort of made a point of that, in that it took a year and a half to get to her origin story. I mean, we kept sort of finding out things about her, but that led to something else that we didn't know, and that led to something else. And I was having a great time doing that. So that's why I have an attachment to Mantis, that she was the one who really taught me a lot about writing characters, that you can't just insist, that this character is gonna do this, because then you're just checking off boxes and stuff. You're not actually writing people. And so
Were you surprised? Were you surprised to see her, Steve, show up in the Guardians of the Galaxy film?
Well, I was, when I heard that she was going to be in it, I was very pleased. When I actually saw the movie, I was not pleased because it's not the same character. I do like Pom Klementieff, who played her, and I liked the character on screen. I liked the Mantis in the James Gunn movies, but it's not my Mantis, right? And that's a case where, again, I accept the fact that they needed to do what they needed to do, but I had put a lot of sweat equity into the character that she was. And, and I've said so publicly. I mean, it's not a secret. I wasn't happy that they changed her. And at the same time, I understand, they had a group and he needed dynamics, and probably the character became what he needed it to be in order for that character to fit in. So that's, the only overlap between the two characters is that they're both female. Everything else is different. So
the idea to be able to understand people's emotions and whatnot, that you had nothing to do with that. That was not a part of your character at all.
Not really. She was empathetic, my character, but not like the one on screen. No.
Sure. So another MCU character that you have a lot to do with is Doctor Strange, played by, what's that British actor's name again who plays
Benedict
him?
Cumberbatch.
Yeah, Benedict, that's right. Which, I don't know if you saw the Sherlock BBC series. You ever see that?
Yeah.
He's incredible. That's his best stuff. He's incredible in that.
Yeah.
He's incredible in that.
He's very good. When I heard that he was cast as Doctor Strange, I was very pleased. Because I knew he was intelligent enough to pull that off, and he looks like Doctor Strange, or can be made to look.
Yeah, and his American accent's not bad either.
No.
Yeah. So You created the iteration of Doctor Strange that we really know of. Why do you think that your version of Doctor Strange really resonated so strongly that Marvel, your Mantis one, they basically used the name, used elements of it, but with Doctor Strange, they're like, we love what Steve's done here. And why do you think that they decided to really revisit some of those story beats that you created?
Well, Doctor Strange was a good character for a long time. I mean, he was created by Steve Ditko, who did weird stuff, and the Ditko Doctor Stranges are good stuff. Plus, he created the visual aspect of what Doctor Strange's mystical world looks like. I mean, that's all good. And then, he continued at kind of the same level after Ditko left. I mean, it kind of went along. But what it was missing, this is when I come onto a series. When I come onto a series, I'm very much do not want to say, oh, now I'm here, so everything's different, right? I mean, I want to honor the character and keep the character going. But what I thought that it was missing was the real cosmic elements. And this was the 70s, right? And there was a lot of, sex, drugs, rock and roll, all that stuff in the 70s. And so what I did there was really pump up the mysticism of it. If he is the Sorcerer Supreme, then what is this world that he's living in? How does that work exactly? It led me actually, I went down to the major occult bookstore in New York City and just walked in. I said, I know nothing but what I need to know to like start writing a magician. And they gave me books on tarot and astrology and stuff like that. And I read them, and to get a sense of what a magician's mind might be like. I am not the Sorcerer Supreme. I'm not a homicidal maniac like the Joker. I mean, it's like every one of these people, I have to like find a way in and figure out who they would be. And with him, I mean, he's dealing in this reality that nobody else is dealing in. And it's all, he knows things that nobody else knows and stuff like that. So I tried to really get that sense of it, that, it was a vast cosmic world that he was living in. And that's, as you say, that's what they did in the movie.
Do you feel like you would have made any changes to Doctor Strange in the MCU? Are you pretty content with what they did?
I'm pretty content. No, I don't know that I would change. Trying to think back if there's anything in those movies, but no, I'm good with those movies.
So, Steve, what did collaboration look like for you with the artists? Like, did you have opportunity? I know that you would write out the stories. Then were you able to sit down with the artists and at least provide some feedback or some commentary to them to really help translate those characters into really strong merchandising prospects? What did that look like?
Well, in the beginning, whenever I would take over a series, I would, get together with the artist and talk about it. Comics, again, is a production line operation. I mean, at month by month, you can't keep sitting down and taking time to talk about this book because you got other books that you need to write, and they have other books they need to draw and so forth. So, but there's two ways to do scripts. One is the traditional sort of panel one. Two guys are talking on Zoom. He says, panel two. The other way was what was called Marvel style, which was totally prevalent at the time and apparently is pretty much gone now. But I would write out just the synopsis of what the story was. Anything that you needed to know as an artist, I would tell you. And if you didn't need to know it, I wouldn't tell you. It's like, but then the artist gets to tell the story in the best visual manner. It's still my story, but he's pacing it and presenting it in a way that works for him as an artist. And then it would come back to me to write the dialogue, and I would be looking at the art that you were going to see on the page, writing the dialogue to fit that. That to me was the best way to do it, because then he had freedom. I had the ability to like do whatever I needed to do to make it all come out the way I wanted it to come out. but there was that. If you do it the first way, the script in advance thing, you kind of visualize what they're going to draw and you write to that. But if they don't draw that, if they don't get it or they draw it wrong or something like that, then the dialogue doesn't fit the pictures and so forth. On the other hand, that makes it a whole lot easier for editors to like read it. And so that's the approved way of doing it now. I was lucky that we mostly did that. But Batman was done script in advance because I was leaving the country and I couldn't sit around and wait for it to be drawn. So all that stuff was done that way. And as it turns out, Marshall Rogers prefers to do it, work off a script in advance. He likes to have everything laid out for him, and then he can work around the edges. So it's that there's two ways to doing it. When you're the writer and you sit down with the artist, one of the things you say is, how would that work for you? Which one do you want to do? How does that work for you? And you do that. I mean, that again is part of the job, is that you have to give the artist something that works for him.
I guess that's wonderful happenstance, Steve, because if you were heading off to Europe today and you're on the Eurorail, you would have your laptop with you. You'd be connecting to Wi-Fi via the rail line, and you could basically co-collaborate virtually. But back in the day, like you said, logistically, you had to just basically get it all done, hand it over, and let go.
Yeah. Yep. That was the way it worked. I will say, just the Marvel style sort of came to be because when Stanley and Jack Kirby were doing so many Marvel books at the same time, Stan would say to Jack, here's what the story's about, and let Jack tell the story. But that sort of evolved over time into Stan saying, well, they fight this issue, Jack. And then Jack would do like the whole thing, which later began to piss Jack off because he was the one who was actually plotting all these stories and not getting the credit for it. So you can, if you unload all your responsibilities onto the other guy, that's not a good idea. But if you guys are working, if both of you are on the same page with that, then that's fine.
So you worked with you worked with, or you connected with Stan Lee quite a bit as well, Steve?
Yeah, over time, when I took that job on the low level end of the editorial staff, Stan was still the editor in chief, and for about 6 months we overlapped, our time at Marvel, and it was then after 6 months that he basically left the comic book company and went to, not the company, but he stopped doing comics. He went to Hollywood and started trying to convince people that they should make movies out of this stuff. And so, I knew him then. And then in the year, I think about 2000, he was going to do a thing called Stanley Media. He was going to do interactive comics on the internet. As it turned out, the internet was still too slow in those days to be able to have animation actually happening in real time. So the thing didn't work, but that's Stan, that he was envisioning that. He was thinking, how can I do this? And put a company together and hired me, as among other people, to, so I wrote stuff for that never made it anywhere. But so he and I, we would kind of intersect at places along the way. So, I wish I'd known him better, but I did know him. Yeah.
So he headed to Hollywood. Is he credited with, I think the first Marvel film that came out, I could be wrong, is Howard the Duck. I think that was.
Yeah, that could be
one of the first ones. Was he basically the impetus behind that? Was he the one that was really pushing for Marvel to find itself in film?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, that Howard the Duck was created by Steve Gerber, art by Frank Brunner and Val Mayrick, other people. Howard the Duck was a very sarcastic, offbeat character. And I think it was done by Lucasfilms. I think Lucasfilms did that movie. Didn't do well, but I don't know Stan's involvement in that. I don't know how, where he was in that.
Now, Marvel actually gave up a lot of their cinematic rights to a lot of their characters. I mean, one really famous one is that everyone knows is that Spider-Man is owned by Sony, I believe. And then, Disney buys Marvel. Disney buys Fox, so that's why we see the Fantastic Four coming back and X-Men and whatnot. But wasn't it because of like hemorrhaging at Marvel or fiscal issues that they basically started to sell off their properties to those other studio houses?
That I do not know. I don't know their internals. From what I understand, that Stan and those people were trying to get Marvel characters on screen, and the deal they were offered was, we'll buy the rights to these particular characters.
Gotcha.
Whether they needed to do that to pay the bills, I don't know. But yeah, in the beginning, they had to sell things off, but then they got their own act together and went on to create the MCU.
Well,
And
speaking of,
and again, as you say,
yeah,
it's all come back now, right? But
absolutely. The powerhouse of Disney was able to bring everything back, bar
well, and also, I mean,
bar Spider-Man, but they're kind of working things through with that.
right? And again, I've been praising James Gunn. I can praise Kevin Feige as well. I mean, Fox did not have Kevin Feige, and so most of their movies were, the X-Men movies were pretty good, but the Fantastic Four movies weren't. The all the Spider-Man villain movies pretty dubious. Morbius and Craven and Madam Web particularly. I mean, so Fox had the rights to some of these characters, but they didn't have the people to actually do them. And so it was good that those characters could come back to the MCU.
My wife, she's from Wales, and she was in orchestra with the original actor that played Mr. Fantastic when Fox owned them. So that's her connection with him.
He was in an orchestra?
Yeah, he was.
Huh.
He was actually. He's Welsh, and my wife is Welsh, and he was in a Welsh-speaking soap opera on Welsh television, and he was
Okay.
also a great musician as well. So that's
Yeah,
her connection with him. And I asked about him, Mr. Fantastic, and she did tell me that all of the girls in the orchestra had a big crush on him. So that's no big surprise.
sure. Sure. Well, that's cool.
So Steve, how about you in Hollywood? I know that you work like as a consultant with Hollywood in regards to all of the work that you've done over the years. What's that look like for you?
You've overstated it. For one thing, I didn't work on all the stuff that I involved with. I
Sure.
worked on the Batman movie. I created a character called Nightman, and they made him into a TV show. And I worked on that. Hollywood is. I don't think there's any mysteries to Hollywood. It's a lot of flash. There's a lot of insincerity, but on the other hand, you can be on a big screen and make a lot of money. I mean, so it's a very interesting genre, but I never had any illusions about it. I will say though, when I first went, got to drop all the way back, but in about 1966, I went to DC and asked, could I talk to somebody? Because I was just learning about comics and all that. And they actually sent me in to talk to Julie Schwartz, whom I worked for on Batman later. And Julie very kindly gave me a half hour of his time, plus a bunch of original artwork on the way out the door, because he was like, fans didn't come around. He didn't, he was pleased to see somebody who had an interest. But I came out of there and I remember thinking, and this is not specific to Julie, but I mean, it was like, these guys are not demigods, this is a guy and he's doing his job. I did not say, oh, I could be somebody who could do that job, but I put that away. I said, people are not, you can be in awe of them, but they're not really, you don't have to be. And then when I wrote,
Sorry, sorry to interrupt you for a second, Steve. That's super ironic because if you don't know this, there are many young people that are writers who love comics that have done the same to you.
well,
So,
I'm not a demigod. When I wrote my first script for Nightman, they invited me down to watch them film it. And the first time that I walked into the set, it was actually filmed in an actual store, that scene they were doing. But there were people with boom mics and people with lighting and actors saying my words. And I just went, ooh, it's Hollywood. I just, so I geeked out when I actually saw that thing. And I remembered thinking, well, they're not demigods, but boy, this is cool to watch them film this thing. So, yeah, but no, I'm just a guy who, turns out I could write comics. That's
It's got to be pretty encouraging and exciting to see like the not just the writing that you've done, but the creation that came out of your mind find its way into popular culture, into film. That's got to be exciting.
It is, and it's weird at the same time because again, doing all those comics, I was doing them in the moment, for the people at the time. We sort of touched on this earlier, and now it's like history. It's like those are the 70s comics, and those are the guys who wrote the 70s comics, and it's like I've been folded into history for people who follow that particular history. And that's weird because it's like nobody except Stan probably, but I mean, nobody thought, how will this, it comes back to where we started all this 50 years from now. I mean, who would figure that 50 years later, all that stuff would still be in print because it's still selling, because people still like it. It's like, who knew that was going to happen, right? I certainly didn't.
Well, I mean, to some degree, you having to come to grips with the Vietnam War, you becoming a conscientious objector, you having that veil, taken off of your eyes, that really translated into your writing. And
Mm.
I think it's probably the sincerity in your storytelling which has caused it to still exist today.
Well, yeah, I I am sincere about it. I mean, I'm not giving you the, hey, we're not really doing anything here. I wrote those stories as if I believed in them because I did believe in them. I mean, it's like I never thought I was Captain America, but in the time that I'm writing Captain America's head, I'm trying to get real. What would that be like? That's always the thing. What would that actually be like if that happened? Which then is good for comics because things are always happening that are imaginary that wouldn't happen in the real world. But, you get to go, well, if it did though, how would that work?
Well, Steve, there you go, though. I mean, honestly, why is it still around? Because it's relatable. And to your point, you really wanted to ensure that there was empathy with it. And that's why folks still tune in and purchase comics and hand over a lot of money to go see movies because it's relatable.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, speaking of being relatable, Steve, something that you and I chatted about earlier was the fact that you just got back from a Comic
Right.
Con or of some sort, and just reflecting on decades of fan conventions. Which moment, may they be cosplays or panels or fan art tributes, would you say really touched you the most regarding your character's cultural reach? Are there any like touchstones out there that you can reflect on that really resonated with you where you're like, man, folks, this is really way outside of what I created now, and this is really resonating with the fans and with people outside of myself?
Well, I would go back to individual reactions. I mean, I have had letters where people said, my parents were getting divorced and I was thinking about suicide and I read that comic and it got me through that period and so forth. I mean, that's an extreme example, but I've had letters like that where, uh, you know, that again, unexpected. Who knew, right? I didn't think about who's reading this stuff. I just knew that people were reading it and that was all I knew. But the stories that people tell about how that particular story, that particular series resonated in their life at that point or however, that's the stuff that I think would touch me the most. That again, who knew I would have that influence, right? And so I'm so pleased to have had that influence in those cases.
So, in regards to influence, Steve, in your mind, how would you really measure the success of your career? Would you measure that by sales, by fan engagement, maybe artistic achievement? How would you define success?
I mean, everything you just mentioned, I guess. I mean, we were taught you had to have sales. I mean, if you didn't have sales, you couldn't do the job. But I've had some really good looking books, things that have really worked out well. And as you say, I just went to Terrificon back in Connecticut, and people of all ages are coming up to me, and they're happy to meet me. And I don't it it's not an ego thing for me, it's just like I'm happy that they're happy. I mean, it's like I'm glad I did something that they that made them happy, that did something for them. So, I mean, all of that adds up to success. Yes, I've got success, but I mean, it's just, I just have to say again, it's just weird that, I wasn't sitting there 50 years ago going, yes, I have a plan and I'm going to get to where this is all. It's just like, no, man, I just want to write a good comic this week. And then I want to write another one next week. And then, I hope it sells and all that.
So, your story, I mean, it sounds like if we go back to the very beginning of our conversation, Steve, you show up to New York, you connect with someone that you really resonate with, and he basically challenges you and says like, "Hey, I know you're in the army, but I'd love for you to spend time with me on the weekends and work on this." And
Right.
so it was honestly a lot of like happen chance that
Absolutely, it
that,
was.
that you pivoted
Absolutely.
into this.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that Neil Adams would take on an assistant. Later, he took on a bunch of people. They were called the Krusty Bunkers. He had a whole bunch of assistants, but I was the first one in that thing. But I mean, why would I go to New York and ask this famous guy if I could work for him, And why would I, people over the years have said, well, what was the secret of your thing? It's like right place, right time. I just happened to be, I happened to be in the office when they needed somebody to write a monster story. So, I happened to, I mean, I did go to Neil. I mean, that wasn't happenstance that I worked with Neil, but I was just sort of, I mean, I didn't know anything. I didn't know the future. I just was like doing what seemed like the right thing to do at the time. And did I want to write this story or didn't I? Did I want to come in 5 days a week or did I only want to come in 4 days? And, it's just like I made choices and, I had opportunities and everything went great, but none of it is a blueprint for anybody else, right? I mean, nobody else could follow that same path other than just, when I was in between comics, I designed games for Atari at one point, and I was doing something for
What games did you design, Steve?
none of them came out. They canceled or they sold Atari and they all got trashed.
Did you work in the Bay for Atari while you were
Yeah,
there?
in Silicon Valley. Yeah.
Did you get a chance to work alongside Steve Jobs at all when he was at
No,
Atari?
no, 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 no. Steve Jobs was Apple and this was Atari. It was 82 to 84 when I did that. But I was doing one thing for Atari and then I was offered a chance to do something else, but no raise in pay. And I thought, well, I don't know if I'm supposed to do another job here, then I should get paid. And my wife said, if you don't go through that door, you'll never know what's on the other side, which I think is words to live by. I mean,
Mhm,
that's the deal.
mhm.
It may not always, you may at some point choose not to go through the door. You may not think that what's on the other side is something you really want, but by and large, if there's an opportunity and you don't hate it to start with, I would say go through the door and see what's over there. If nothing else, it just gives you more experience to do whatever else you're doing.
If you're at a Comic-Con and a young person that loves to write says, "Hey, Steve, I want to have a career like you," what advice do you give them?
Well, I can advise them on how to write. I mean, the business is so different now, right? I mean, it's like we sold 1 million copies of everything. When it got down toward 350,000, that was where cancellation loomed. And today, if you sell 30,000, it's a big deal, right? I mean, all the energy for people is in the movies and very little of it's in the comics. And there's still people who love to do comics and they're doing comics, but they're doing it under a very different regime. They're not, the reach is much different. The editorial, I mean, again, Roy came to me and said, you're writing Captain America now. If that happened today, there'd be 17 layers of vice presidents and merchandising people and all that who'd have to sign off on everything you did with Captain America because now he's a property, right? So I can only say write the best stories that you can write, but they have hurdles they have to get over that I didn't have to get over. So I can't say, oh, well, I know exactly how you're supposed to do this now,
It's a different time. It's a different place. That's a good word.
Yeah.
So Steve, just, thinking about your incredible mark on culture, when you look back at the body of your work, what would you say is the enduring message or theme that you really hope resonates with people?
Well, I just like heroes. I mean, the idea of a hero doing something not only good but interesting, But I think I sort of resonate to the hero archetype. That's why I quit Marvel at one point, DC at another point. I mean, it's like I get pissed off because they're not doing what I think they ought to be doing for the betterment of the whole thing. There's an obscure way of saying things, but I mean, there's always been and always will be a place for stories of heroes, and there's also a place for things that are done well. And there's plenty of bad stories about heroes, and there's plenty of good stories about things that aren't heroic. But apparently, I am part of a lot of people's ideas of what heroes should be, and that's all I got.
Yeah, I'd say that going back to that original commentary about Batman and Captain America and the reboots that you did for them, is that not only did you highlight and want to really show heroes, but you wanted to throw you wanted to show the three-dimensional aspect of what a hero is, meaning that it's not always easy to be a hero, and it's not always easy to do the right thing, and heroes get tempted just like everybody else. And that whole Superman commentary we had earlier too is he's a little simple at times, when in reality to be a hero or to do heroic things can be difficult, can't it?
Yeah, that's true.
So, Steve, as we wrap up, and I just want to thank you for winding through what is just a really colorful career and history where you have taken so much of your creativity and you've gifted that to people across the world, and we've really benefited from it. Is there any final thing that you'd like to share with us before we wrap up?
No, I think we've covered it. I liked what you said about gifting it to the world. I mean, that's, again, wasn't my plan, but that's what happened, and I'm glad that it did.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for being on the Wide Lens podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Steve.
That's a wrap on the Wide Lens podcast. If today's episode broadened your view of history, please follow, rate, and review us. It makes a real difference. A heartfelt thanks to our guests for their story and to Sergei Shadrin for providing the music. Know someone who's witnessed a pivotal moment? Drop us a line at ideas@widelenspodcast.com. Their story could be next. Until next time, keep looking at history through the wide lens.